It is said that some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. For Alexander of Macedonia, all three were true. So let's look at his foolproof plan for historical fame. Alexander of Macedonia was born in Pella, Macedonia, in 356 BCE. The exact date is unknown, as the ancient Greeks followed their own calendar, but we know he was born in the month of Hecatombeon. His first steps towards the title Great were taken before he was born. Having two ruthlessly ambitious parents certainly set him on the path to greatness. Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, came to power after the deaths of his two older brothers. He proved to be a more competent leader than either of them. He innovated the Macedonian army, invaded Paeonia, where he defeated the Illyrians, and dominated Greece with a combination of warfare and diplomacy. By his death in 336 BCE, he had started to unite Greece, something that Alexander would take over. Alexander's mother was equally ambitious and perhaps more ruthless than his father. The daughter of the king of Epirus, she was Philip's fourth wife, and their marriage served to strengthen his western frontier. Supposedly, her name had initially been Myrtale, but she changed it to Olympias in recognition of her husband's success in the Olympic Games of 356 BCE. It was her mercilessness that secured Alexander's place on the throne, a trait that Alexander would display during his rule. After Philip's assassination, Olympias ordered the death of Philip's seventh wife, Cleopatra, and her children. It is worth noting that some sources claim Cleopatra only had a daughter with Philip, while others cite that she also had a son shortly before her death. The point is moot, however, as they all died at the command of Olympias, with Cleopatra taking her own life after her kids were murdered. Olympias outlived her son, but was eventually killed by relatives of people she had executed. Alexander's life is littered with legends. One of the first comes from how he acquired his famous horse, Bucephalus. At around 13 years of age, Alexander had accompanied Philip to look at a horse. The horse was magnificent, but unmanageable by anyone who attempted to ride him. The young Alexander shrewdly noticed that the horse was spooked by his own shadow, and so made a bet that he would be able to ride him. Alexander turned the horse towards the sun and was able to mount and ride him, prompting his father to exclaim, "My son, Macedonia is too small for you. You better find a kingdom your own size." It seems that Alexander took this challenge to heart and would attempt just that in the future. At the age of 13, Alexander's parents decided to ensure that he had the best education available to him at the time. His tutor is considered to be one of the greatest intellectual figures in Western history, the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle inspired in Alexander an interest in scientific investigation, philosophy, and medicine. However, Alexander would not prescribe to his tutor's belief that anyone who wasn't Greek should be treated as a slave. While historians dispute how much Aristotle's tutelage affected Alexander's later reign, it is undeniable that the work of his old teacher would have inspired Alexander's quest for scientific and geographical knowledge. 3 years later, Alexander's education under Aristotle was complete. Alexander would have been taught combat and military strategy alongside his formal education, probably in part by his father. At 16, he was left in charge of Macedonia while his father led the army to attack Byzantium. Even as a teenager, Alex was a successful military leader, although this may have been at least partially due to the well-trained and experienced Macedonian army. Alexander also fought alongside his father, commanding the left wing at the Battle of Chaeronea. But Alexander and Philip didn't always get along, and after Philip divorced Olympias and married Cleopatra, a quarrel led to Olympias fleeing to Epirus with her two children. Despite the father and son reconciling, Alexander's position as heir appeared to be jeopardized. However, Alexander's reputation for greatness on the battlefield won him the support of the army. This fidelity meant that Alexander succeeded him without opposition when Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE. Just to be sure, though, Alexander executed any rivals along with anyone who opposed his succession. Alexander was 20 when he ascended to the throne, and he had already demonstrated the beginnings of being a great leader. Alexander did not hesitate to continue his father's legacy, which he would soon surpass. As great as Alexander was, he was not averse to extreme acts of violence and callousness to achieve his goals. Shortly after his ascension, rumors persisted of his death, the result of which was a Theban revolt. Alexander marched his army 240 miles to Thebes in just 2 weeks. On his arrival, the Thebans refused to surrender. Supposedly, Alexander razed the city to the ground, killing 6,000 people and sold all the survivors into slavery. He did, however, spare the house of the Greek poet Pindar and the temples of the city. The severity of this attack meant that Alexander could treat other cities, like Athens, more leniently, as the Greek city-states had all seen the shocking result of resisting him. There are many anecdotes about Alexander's life, and their truth is uncertain. However, the legends persist and add to his historical legacy. One such story describes an encounter while Alexander and his army were touring the Greek city-states accepting oaths of allegiance. Alexander saw a naked man who was around 70, sunning himself in the street. Intrigued by this man's lack of awe at the sight of the king and his entourage, Alexander approached him and declared, "I am Alexander, the great king." But the man simply replied, "I am Diogenes the dog." Amused, Alexander offered the man anything he wanted, to which Diogenes asked, "I would like you to stand out of my sun." Instead of being insulted, Alexander showed great admiration for Diogenes, telling his companions, "If I were not Alexander, I wish I was Diogenes." It seems strange that a man who would conquer the known world would wish to be a Greek philosopher who had shunned all material items and lived in a barrel. But perhaps this was another layer to his greatness, that he saw a simple life free from ambition as one to be envied. However, he was Alexander, and as such was destined to the life of a conqueror. After subduing Greece, Alexander set his sights on the riches of Persia. In 334 BCE, Alexander and his army crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait which separates Asia and Europe. On approaching their landing site, Alexander supposedly threw his spear onto the shore, pulling it from the sand upon disembarking and declaring that the lands would be won by the spear. Due to his education and his love for Homer's Iliad, Alexander already had knowledge of some areas in Asia. He was not always in the mood for destruction, and his military campaigns sometimes doubled as tourism. Alexander visited the famous city of Troy to make sacrifices and get a sacred shield from the Temple of Athena. Another famous legend from Alexander's life was the untying of the Gordian knot. According to folklore, an oracle told the Phrygian people who lived in modern-day central Turkey that the first man to ride into town on an ox cart would be made king. The lucky fellow, a peasant named Gordius, dedicated his cart to Zeus following his coronation and tied it to a pole outside the city using cornel bark, which hardens over time. It was said that whoever untied the knot would rule all of Asia. Of course, the 23-year-old Macedonian conqueror could not pass up an opportunity like this. In 333 BCE, he marched to the Phrygian capital of Gordium, determined to untie the knot. On arrival, he found the knot quite impossible to undo, as there were no ends and no way to even get started. Proving that men in their early 20s have not changed much over time, he drew his sword and sliced the knot in half. Not wanting to argue with the guy holding a sharp sword and backed up by a huge army, it was declared that Alexander had successfully untied the knot. This story is now synonymous with an intricate problem that requires an unconventional solution. After defeating the Persians at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander traveled to Egypt. The Persians had ruled the Egyptians for nearly 200 years, with intervals of independence, and gladly welcomed Alexander, anointing him as pharaoh. As in Asia, Alexander was drawn to cultural legends. It is thought that he traveled through the desert to the shrine of Zeus Ammon. Supposedly, his journey was guided by ravens and blessed with rain, and upon his arrival at the temple, the priest declared that he was the son of Zeus. Alexander destroyed a lot of cities, but he also founded more than 20 new ones, naming most of them after himself. The most famous is Alexandria, although its renowned library would be built after his death. In 331 BCE, just 5 years after he had become the king of Macedonia, Alexander defeated the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela and was crowned king of Asia. To ingratiate himself with his newly conquered people, he dressed like a Persian and married a Sogdian or Bactrian princess called Roxanne. His army thought that attempting to please a defeated nation was below him. Still, Alexander knew the power of culture and demonstrated skill in administration that was akin to his military prowess. He incorporated native rulers into his government and set up democracies in many areas. These acts ingratiated him amongst the conquered people and enabled him to spread Hellenistic monetary systems and culture across his empire. He surrounded himself with learned people, including historians, scientists, engineers, and architects, a further example of his fondness for knowledge. Alexander's last great campaign started in the summer of 327 BCE, when he invaded India. He was clearly a charismatic man, even making an ally out of a former enemy. In 326, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, Alexander fought his last great battle. Despite being outnumbered, he was victorious and won the respect and loyalty of the opposing King Porus. It was here that his energy and enthusiasm outlasted that of his army. They mutinied and insisted on returning home rather than continuing the campaign. Alexander reluctantly complied, returned to Persia, and sent many of his veterans home with honor and riches. Alexander's thirst for exploration was not sated, and in 323 BCE he traveled back to Babylon intending to explore Arabia, but was taken ill and died on June 13, 323. The cause of his death is highly disputed, with some historians suspecting he was poisoned and others maintaining that it was due to natural causes. Alexander the Great was born to greatness, with his influential parents founding his legacy in comprehensive education. He inherited a kingdom on the brink of almost total domination, having greatness thrust upon him by his position. But he achieved greatness by being a superb military leader and tactician, and through his unbridled ambition. During his 11 years of campaigning, Alexander never lost a significant battle. In 32 years, Alexander achieved what most of us can only dream of, given a whole lifetime. He was truly great. To learn more about Alexander the Great, check out our book, Alexander the Great, a captivating guide to the king who conquered the Persian Empire and Babylon, including his impact on ancient Greece and Rome. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.